The valley lay quiet under a pale dawn sky, wrapped in a low blanket of silver fog that drifted slowly across the fields like a patient memory refusing to fade. Past the creek and beyond the rows of weather-beaten pines stood a modest farmhouse, its white paint chipped and worn by years of wind, rain, and time. It wasn't a palace and it wasn't new, but it carried the kind of character forged by hard work and scars that refused to heal. This was the home of Eleanor Hayes, a widowed farm owner struggling to hold on to the last piece of life she once knew. Eleanor had not always lived alone. There had been a time when the property hummed with laughter, ironwork, and the steady rhythm of purpose. Her husband, Samuel Hayes, had been a craftsman, builder, and man of remarkable patience, someone who built things to last. His workshop sat just to the east of the farmhouse, a sturdy wooden structure he had built by hand long before the land was swallowed into Whispering Ridge estates and placed under the jurisdiction of the newly formed Homeowners Association. Back then the land had been free, no rules, no board, no strangers pretending to own rights they never earned. Samuel was gone now, a quiet tragedy that had struck one winter morning 3 years earlier when his heart failed him out in the fields. No warnings, no goodbyes. One moment he was working, the next he was a memory. Since that day, Eleanor had carried the burden of both grief and survival. She worked the land alone, kept the fields trimmed, and maintained the old house as best as she could. But she kept that workshop exactly as Samuel had left it. It stood there not as a structure but as a tribute, a reminder of the man who had built every inch of their life together. It was more than wood and nails, it was legacy. That legacy became a target. The first letter came in a crisp white envelope, pressed with an embossed seal bearing 3 letters Eleanor had come to despise: HOA Whispering Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. She had never asked to be a part of it. Her land had been annexed when the developers bought everything around her and forced rural landowners into a suburban contract. She had ignored their flyers, their meetings, their surveys. She owned her land. She paid her taxes. She needed no permission to exist, but the HOA thought differently. Their letter was polite but sharp, like a velvet glove hiding a knife. It informed her that her late husband's workshop violated community visual standards. New guidelines had been approved requiring secondary structures to meet architectural conformity. Terms like unauthorized construction and structural noncompliance filled the page like a foreign language. The letter demanded she remove the workshop within 30 days or face escalating fines and legal action. The second letter came 2 weeks later. This one was not polite. It accused her of ignoring prior notice and listed an initial fine of $2,500, increasing daily. It referred to her workshop as an eyesore and an unregistered structure, as if it were some kind of contraband. The letter ended with a threat that made Eleanor's blood turn cold. Failure to comply may result in lien action against your property. That one sentence was enough to send a chill deeper than any February wind. It meant they could take her land. She had lived through loss before, but losing the land would mean losing Samuel all over again. Eleanor's first instinct was disbelief. She had heard stories of ridiculous HOA disputes in the suburbs, grass height, mailbox color, garden decor, but this was her ranch, her livelihood. The workshop wasn't modern, but it was clean, safe, and weatherproof. It wasn't hurting anyone, it wasn't intruding on anyone, yet the HOA wanted it gone simply because it did not match the visual harmony of the neighborhood. Whispering Ridge Estates had changed the valley. What had once been wide stretches of farmland had been carved up into cul-de-sacs, circular drives, and luxury cabins disguised as country homes. Its residents were not farmers or craftsmen. They were outsiders, retirees escaping the city, tech workers who wanted scenic mountain views, people who loved the concept of country life but hated the authenticity of it. They brought rules, committees, restrictions, and now their board of directors declared that Samuel's workshop didn't belong. Eleanor folded the letter and set it down, but she did not destroy it. She did not cry. Instead, she walked across the yard and stood in front of the workshop. Dusty windows, metal tools hanging neatly on the walls inside, a lantern still hanging from a wooden beam. Samuel's initials carved into the doorframe. To her, this place was sacred, but to the HOA, it was just another violation. She considered her options. She could ignore them. She could fight them. She could call a lawyer she couldn't afford. She could beg for mercy from people who had none. But Eleanor Hayes had been raised by land and labor. Her husband had taught her that the only way to deal with bullies was to not bow down. She had already lost too much. She was not going to lose this. But she had no idea yet that this fight would uncover something much bigger than a workshop violation. Something buried, something corrupted, something the HOA had spent years hiding. She thought she was defending her land. She didn't know yet she was about to declare war. The next morning she drove into town to gather whatever information she could about property rights, land use laws, and HOA jurisdiction. The local county clerk gave her a stack of dense legal documents that made her head spin, but one thing stood out. The HOA did not legally exist when the workshop was built. Samuel had constructed it 15 years ago. Whispering Ridge Estates HOA was formed only 7 years ago. That meant it could not legally impose retroactive architectural laws on pre-existing structures. That discovery gave Eleanor hope, fleeting but powerful. However, hope vanished when she returned home to find a fresh notice pinned to her front door: final warning before lien placement. The fines had now grown to $18,300. The letter was signed by Meredith Crane, HOA president. The name Eleanor would soon come to know very well, too well. Meredith Crane was known in town even before the HOA existed. Wealthy, controlling, a self-appointed guardian of community standards, she had influence, money, and the kind of political connections that made people nervous. Eleanor suspected Meredith had personal motives. This felt targeted, intentional, vindictive. What Eleanor did not know was that Meredith had far more to hide than Eleanor could imagine. And the workshop was only the excuse, a distraction in a much larger scheme. The fight was no longer about aesthetics. It was about power. As dusk fell across the valley, Eleanor stood once more in the doorway of Samuel's workshop. The air was heavy, the horizon burned orange. Somewhere in the distance, a storm was gathering, and though she didn't yet understand the path ahead, she knew this: she would not run, she would not bend, and she would not give up. If the HOA wanted a battle, then she would give them something they had never faced before: resistance with roots deeper than any law they could write. The land held secrets, the HOA held lies, and soon those worlds were going to collide. Morning came with the stubborn gray of a sky that refused to clear. Eleanor awoke exhausted, not from sleep but from the weight of what lay ahead. Her kitchen table was buried in papers, fines, violation notices, copies of county zoning laws, and property agreements dating back decades. The Whispering Ridge Estates HOA claimed authority over her land, but the more she read, the more she uncovered inconsistencies. The documents referenced restrictive covenants that had never been filed with the county clerk. The legal descriptions of her property didn't match the association's maps. Their letters quoted policies that did not exist in any public record. Something was wrong, very wrong. She had planned to spend the day gathering legal support, but fate interrupted. A truck rolled slowly up her dirt road, tires grinding against gravel. It wasn't a friendly visit. She could always tell by the way certain vehicles approached: slow, measured, self-important. This one belonged to the HOA. Three people stepped out: Meredith Crane, wearing a tailored blazer unsuited for country dirt, her posture radiating practiced superiority. Behind her stood Victor Saunders, the HOA treasurer, whose face bore the expression of a man who believed his signature held real power. The third was a lawyer, anonymous, in a cold gray suit, carrying a briefcase and wearing the permanent smirk of someone accustomed to scaring people with paperwork. They had come not to negotiate, but to deliver a warning. Meredith surveyed the property with a calm cruelty. Her eyes moved across the fields and fences before pausing on the workshop, as though it personally offended her existence. She stepped toward it as if she already owned it. Eleanor didn't speak. Words were useless in the presence of people like this, people who hid behind rules they created. The attorney produced a thick envelope: legal intimidation by design. Inside was a notice of lien intent and cease and desist order, now expanded to include the barn roof, her tractor shelter, and even her fencing. The HOA had escalated. They claimed her workshop violated code. Now they were attacking everything she owned. Each structure had been labeled an unauthorized outbuilding. This was not enforcement, this was aggression. The lawyer explained that they were filing a lien within 72 hours. The lien would prevent her from selling, refinancing, or legally opposing HOA action unless fines were paid. Fines that had now accumulated to over $28,000, an impossible number for a widow farmer living season to season. The threat was clear: comply or lose everything. But Eleanor was no fool. She knew what this really was. They wanted her land. Whispering Ridge Estates had reached its final phase of development. Everything around her had been sold, built, and marketed to new buyers. Everything except her land. Her property sat on the only elevation in the valley with sweeping views of the mountains. Developers wanted it for a luxury lodge or a private club, and Meredith Crane, whose husband ran the local land development firm, would stop at nothing to get it. Their true aim was becoming painfully clear: they were going to pressure her until she sold. When they finally left, Eleanor did not watch them go. She turned to the workshop, the barn, and the land that had always been her home. She was being boxed in, surrounded by a quiet war waged through legal threats and silent coercion. She needed help, but not from lawyers in town who bowed to influence. She needed someone who understood land, someone who valued loyalty over fear. She found her first ally at a rusty gate off Mill Creek Road. Henry Walker was a retired surveyor and one of Samuel's old friends. He once mapped the entire stretch of Whispering Ridge before developers ever touched it. Now he spent most of his days in quiet retirement. But when Eleanor asked for help reviewing property lines, he didn't hesitate. Old loyalty still mattered in rural towns. Henry spent hours walking the property perimeter. His weathered boots moved with careful purpose, eyes sharp to even the smallest disruption in landmarkers. When he returned to the house at dusk, his jaw was tight, a sign of bad news. He had found several freshly moved boundary stakes placed without Eleanor's knowledge. Someone had adjusted the maps. Someone had altered the lines of her land. Developers had pushed boundaries literally. They had cut off part of her western field and absorbed it into the HOA's development map. And worse, Henry discovered survey tags leading deeper into her property, markings for future construction. Someone was planning to bulldoze part of her land and had done so under the cover of paperwork. It was trespass, it was illegal, and someone had done it with quiet precision. This was no longer just a dispute with an HOA board, this was land theft. Henry urged Eleanor not to go to the county commissioners just yet. Whispering Ridge development had political ties. Complaints would disappear before they reached a courtroom. Instead, he advised gathering evidence, proof that land stakes had been moved, proof of fraudulent maps, and proof of HOA misconduct. No accusations without proof. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The house felt haunted with the heaviness of Samuel's absence. He had been a builder, he had fought droughts, storms, and debt, but even he had never imagined a future where paper and greed could steal land as easily as a thief in the night. Eleanor stood in the workshop doorway, hands trembling, but not from fear. Something inside her had hardened, something had awakened. She would not sell, she would not surrender, she would not be erased. If they wanted a war, she would give them one. The next day, the first move came from her. She drove to the county records office again, but this time not to search but to request certified historical records. She asked for every filed land map, every deed revision, every architectural application, every financial disclosure from the Whispering Ridge Estates HOA. The clerk tried to discourage her, explaining the volume would be massive. Eleanor didn't care, she ordered everything. What she found was more than she expected. Quiet patterns emerged, HOA board members approving property variances for friends, awarding construction contracts to relatives, and issuing fines selectively against long-standing landowners. Some violations were forgiven for cash payments not recorded in official ledgers. Others disappeared entirely from public records but remained in HOA bank statements as miscellaneous income. Someone had been skimming, someone had been burying files. Corruption wasn't just present, it had roots. Eleanor began building a timeline, organizing evidence. She created folders, labeled files, and took photographs of documents. She wasn't a lawyer, but she was thorough, determined, and relentless. If the HOA wanted to weaponize paperwork, then she would bury them with their own records. But as her proof grew stronger, so did the danger. 3 trucks began circling past her property late at night. Men she didn't recognize slowed down near her fence line. Someone parked outside her gate and watched her through binoculars. A dead raccoon appeared nailed to her fence post as a warning. Someone wanted to intimidate her. Someone wanted her scared. Eleanor didn't break. She didn't show fear. Instead, she installed trail cameras around the property, hidden silent watchers. She recorded every vehicle, every plate number, every trespass. They thought she was alone. They thought she was weak. But they hadn't yet seen what a determined widow could do when pushed into a corner. On day 3 after the ultimatum, an envelope arrived taped to her mailbox. Thick red letters screamed "Final Notice, Lien Imminent." But Eleanor didn't tear it down. Instead, she took a photograph of it, because now every threat they made was becoming evidence. The war had officially begun. And Eleanor Hayes, a quiet widow with no power and no influence, had just committed to the one thing the HOA never expected. She would fight, and she would not fight alone. Because Whispering Ridge was about to discover something ruthless and immovable. That land remembers its people, and a community remembers injustice. And when truth rises from the ground, it brings destruction. The wind carried change across Whispering Ridge, quiet at first, then persistent, like a rumor gathering strength until it became a force that could no longer be ignored. Eleanor had spent the last several days turning her home into a war room. Her dining table had become a battlefield of files, photographs, financial records, property maps, and surveillance images. What began as a fight over her husband's workshop was transforming into something much larger, a full-scale investigation into the corrupt veins of the Whispering Ridge HOA. Her evidence was no longer scattered fragments, it was beginning to form a story of greed disguised as community standards, of power built on intimidation and falsified paperwork, of stolen land and hidden money. She had the beginnings of a case strong enough to raise questions, but questions were not enough. She needed witnesses, she needed proof that others had suffered under the HOA's control. But in a small town, people feared retaliation. Whispering Ridge was known for crushing resistance. Those who challenged the system either sold their land, moved away, or disappeared into quiet compliance. No one wanted to become a target. No one wanted to stand alone. Yet Eleanor had something the HOA did not: integrity, patience, and the trust of those who had known her for years. She didn't beg for help. She didn't persuade with empty promises. She simply let the truth speak. Her first ally emerged without warning. It happened on a cold morning just as dawn broke, when a farmer named Raymond Dyer pulled his old truck into her driveway. He was a neighbor she barely knew, quiet, simple, and scarred by work. He stood in silence for a long time, staring at the workshop as if it brought back memories. Then he handed Eleanor an envelope. Inside were copies of HOA notices and fines, threats identical to the ones she had received. The HOA had forced him to tear down his father's old barn, calling it structurally obsolete. It had stood for 80 years, it was part of his heritage. They had destroyed it under threat of lien and legal seizure. He did not ask for help, he did not offer a speech, he simply gave Eleanor the records and left. But that was all she needed, her first piece of community testimony. Then another came, an elderly widow named Lydia Moore who had been forced to remove the livestock pen her late husband had built. Then a mechanic named Joe Buckley, whose home business had been shut down by the HOA. Then a single mother who received fines for allowing her children's bicycles on her front porch. One by one they came, people who had suffered, people who had been silenced, people who had been waiting for someone to fight back. The story was spreading, whisper by whisper, across the valley. Not a story of rebellion, but of justice. As the mountain air grew sharper with winter's approach, Eleanor hosted her first secret meeting. It wasn't held in a hall or a bar or a church. It was held in Samuel's workshop on sacred ground. 17 people gathered that night. Farmers, teachers, tradesmen, retired soldiers, ordinary people who had been bullied by a force they were told they could not challenge. They sat on hay bales and overturned buckets and wooden stools, surrounded by the tools Samuel once used. It was not a meeting, it was the beginning of resistance. Some brought letters, others brought financial records, some came only to listen. But every person in that room made a silent pledge: the HOA would not divide them anymore. Eleanor did not lead them with fiery speeches, she led them by purpose. She laid out the evidence she had collected: fraudulent property mappings, suspicious financial activity, survey violations, unauthorized land annexations. She revealed something few knew, that HOA members had profited from land seizures by reselling portions of annexed land through shell companies. And every paper trail led back to one name: Meredith Crane. The woman who had tried to take Eleanor's land was not just power-hungry, she was orchestrating a land-snatching scheme to enrich herself and her circle. But proof was not enough. They needed to make this undeniable. They needed to make it public. They needed to expose the corruption not through lawyers but through truth. One man in the workshop that night would become critical: Tyler Briggs, a quiet ranch hand who rarely spoke, but he had a talent Eleanor didn't: technology. He could build a website, share files, track documents, and record witness testimonies. He agreed to create a digital archive, something impossible to destroy or erase, something that would preserve their evidence even if the HOA tried to bury it. Eleanor's army wasn't made of weapons, it was made of proof. As the days passed, her fight gathered momentum. Anonymous envelopes were left in her mailbox containing board meeting minutes never meant to be seen by the public. Contractor invoices revealed inflated payments, proof of money laundering through HOA projects. One source revealed something darker: an email chain where board members discussed forcing out legacy landowners so property values could be optimized. They had used that phrase as justification for harassment, for intimidation, for displacement. The HOA had underestimated her. They had mistaken her silence for weakness, but the land had taught Eleanor patience, and grief had taught her endurance. She was no longer defending a workshop. She was defending the people who had built this valley long before outsiders came with their rules and entitlement. But Whispering Ridge was not blind. The board knew something was shifting. They responded the only way bullies know how: through escalation. Unmarked vehicles began parking near Eleanor's road again. Motion alarms were triggered in the night. Deep tire ruts appeared behind her barn, proof of trespassers slipping onto her land. The sheriff's department refused to respond to her reports. Calls went unanswered. Messages disappeared. The law was no longer neutral. Then came the most blatant attack. One morning, Eleanor discovered orange demolition stakes hammered into the ground behind her barn, freshly placed, marked with construction tags bearing the initials WRD Development. These stakes were not warnings. They were declarations. The HOA and Whispering Ridge Development were moving forward with plans to build on her land, even while she still owned it. They no longer cared about legal process. They believed they were untouchable. But Eleanor was not the same woman who had received that first violation letter. She had changed. She had been sharpened by injustice, hardened by loss, strengthened by purpose. She removed each stake one by one, then carried them inside the workshop and laid them on the table next to her growing pile of evidence. The message was clear: they would not take her land without a fight. Meanwhile, Tyler published the first set of public records on the website he created, ridgetruth.com. It wasn't much at first, just land maps, survey discrepancies, financial redactions, but it was enough to spark attention. Downloads began, traffic increased, people started talking, and when people talk, corruption trembles. The town was waking up, but Eleanor knew the truth of war: every gain brings retaliation, every strike invites a counterstrike. And Meredith Crane was no fool. She was calculating, vicious, patient. She would not allow her empire to crumble quietly. Eleanor's fight had gone from silent resistance to open defiance, and now something dangerous was coming. She could feel it: the way the air thickened, the way threats evolved, the way enemies grew desperate when cornered. A storm was gathering beyond the ridge, heavy and violent, and it was headed straight for her. End of chapter 3. The storm did not arrive with thunder and rain. It came disguised as silence, calculated, heavy, crawling. The kind of silence that warned of danger moving in the dark. Days passed with no new violation notices, no HOA vehicles patrolling, no contractors loitering near the fence line. The cul-de-sacs below Whispering Ridge carried on in their illusion of peace. But Eleanor Hayes knew better. This was not surrender. This was the calm of an enemy planning its next strike. Whispering Ridge Estates HOA had been cornered. The website ridgetruth.com had begun surfacing in local conversations. Residents whispered behind closed doors about missing funds, fake architectural restrictions, and land grabs disguised as community improvement. Some board loyalists dismissed it as conspiracy, but many others did not. A seed of suspicion had been planted and it was growing. Meredith Crane and her board could feel it. Their control was slipping not by force but by exposure. And so they shifted from intimidation to strategy. If they could not silence Eleanor with fear, they would bury her with the law. The attack began with a lawsuit. A thick envelope arrived, delivered by private courier, sealed with legal arrogance. It contained a 67-page civil complaint filed in county court, Whispering Ridge Estates HOA versus Eleanor Hayes. The accusations were severe: repeated violations, harassment of board members, unauthorized recording of HOA officials, slander, property defamation, and damages exceeding $250,000. The lawsuit claimed she operated an illegal activist organization and referred to her workshop meetings as organized aggression. But the most dangerous part of the lawsuit wasn't the accusations, it was the temporary restraining order hidden inside. It declared that Eleanor was legally prohibited from accessing or altering any disputed structures on her property, including the workshop. The very heart of her resistance had just been sealed by court order. She was also ordered to appear before a judge in 10 days. Eleanor was being dragged into a battlefield she could not avoid. A courtroom fight would cost money she didn't have and time she could not lose. Worse, this order aimed to shut down her evidence gathering. The workshop was now legally off-limits to her. But the HOA had made a critical mistake. They underestimated her resolve. She read the lawsuit page by page. It dripped with manufactured offense and forged outrage. Half of the claims referenced incidents that never occurred, dark fabrications designed to smear her as hostile and unstable. But she didn't panic. She treated it like everything else in this war, an obstacle to break, not a wall to stop her. Late that night she returned to the workshop anyway. The restraining order meant nothing. This was her land, her building, her fight. Inside, the air smelled of sawdust and metal, the smell of Samuel's hands. His tools still rested exactly where he had left them. Standing in that silence gave her strength. She would not bow to paper warfare, but tonight something else was waiting for her. On the workbench lay a folder she hadn't left there. Someone had been inside the workshop. No doors were broken, no windows shattered, yet someone had invaded the only place she considered sacred. The folder was labeled simply, HOA 217. Inside were 3 pages of HOA meeting minutes from 4 years earlier, documents she had never seen before. They contained a secret vote held by the board, approval to use HOA reserve funds for covert land survey operations. Below that was a handwritten note, follow the money. A friend, someone inside the HOA, was leaking documents. This changed everything. Someone close to Meredith Crane had turned. Whether it was fear, guilt, or revenge, someone on the inside wanted the truth out. Eleanor didn't know who they were yet, but they had just handed her a weapon. The next morning she met with her growing group of allies. Henry Walker studied the new documents and confirmed what she suspected. The secret vote aligned perfectly with the timeline of illegal survey stakes being moved on properties. Tyler Briggs uploaded the files anonymously to ridgetruth.com, preserving them online before the HOA could deny their existence. The evidence was no longer just a pile of suspicions. It was becoming a trail clear enough to follow, strong enough to expose. But truth was not the only thing growing. So were the threats. Victor Saunders, the HOA treasurer, filed a police report accusing Eleanor of cyber harassment. Someone slashed the tires of Raymond Dyer's truck in broad daylight. Lydia Moore found her fence destroyed. Whispering Ridge wasn't just watching now. It was striking back, and behind each attack was the same message: stop or pay. Instead, they pushed harder. Tyler and Eleanor found a pattern in HOA financial records, payments written to a company called Greenstone Community Management, all marked as reserve fund allocation. A quick business search revealed the company didn't exist. It had no physical office, no employees, no tax ID. It was a shell, and the registered owner of Greenstone was none other than Victor Saunders. He had been stealing HOA money and funneling it into his own pocket through fake maintenance fees, and he had done it for years. This was criminal fraud, the kind that could destroy people, the kind that could put people in prison. But Eleanor's enemies were planning something far darker. She set a trap. On the 5th night after the lawsuit arrived, she found her home under surveillance. She placed them inside decoy birdhouses hidden behind the barn, inside fence posts. It was a team, 3 men dressed in dark clothing standing beyond the tree line, and most importantly, she left a false binder of evidence inside the workshop in plain sight. They moved with purpose. They didn't hide. Quiet stretch of the American countryside, pure and just beyond the last Henry urged Eleanor to stay inside. Tyler advised moving than the town itself. It belonged to a man named Jack Dawson, a second-generation rancher who believed in 3 things: hard work, quiet living, and staying off other people's business. His ranch stretched across hundreds of rugged acres at the edge of Pine Valley, a growing community that once respected its land roots, until the arrival of a homeowners association changed everything. Jack had never cared for towns, and he certainly had no intention of joining one. He lived on private property, registered outside any community development. His dusty driveway was long and remote, winding through oak trees before disappearing near the main county road. For 20 years he came and went as he pleased, until one morning everything changed. It began with the sound of metal clanking in the distance, echoing through the still dawn. Jack rode his ATV toward the end of his driveway. What he saw made his jaw lock in cold disbelief. A massive iron gate had been installed across the only access road to his land. Behind it stood several workers in reflective vests. Next to them was a brand new sign bolted into the ground like it had been waiting just for this moment. Private Community Road, HOA access only, no entry without authorization. Jack's heartbeat slowed. This wasn't an accident, this was deliberate. A black SUV idled nearby. Out stepped a man he had only heard about in warning, Richard Langford, the newly elected president of the Pine Valley Estates HOA. Richard was tall, polished, and wore the frozen smile of a man who believed money made him untouchable. Rumor was he came from corporate banking, made a fortune, and now ran Pine Valley like his personal empire. The town had warned Jack to stay out of Richard's path. Too late now. A white envelope had been zip-tied to the metal bars of the gate. Jack tore it off and opened it. Inside was a letterhead stamped in gold with the HOA seal. The message was simple but dripping with arrogance. According to Section 14A of Pine Valley Community Road and Maintenance Rules, all property owners using this shared road must register with the HOA and pay a $3,500 annual access and maintenance fee. Failure to comply will result in restricted access. It ended with Richard's signature and an insult disguised as a courtesy. Welcome to the community. But Jack Dawson was not part of their community. He owned his land long before Pine Valley existed. He had paid for the original road construction 15 years earlier. The county records proved it. This gate was not just illegal, it was an act of war. The next few days brought chaos. Jack filed complaints with the sheriff's department, but they claimed it was a civil dispute. The county commissioner said they would look into it. Weeks passed, nothing changed. Worse, Richard and his HOA didn't back off. Instead, they doubled down. Jack received fine notices, threat letters, even an HOA membership invoice, as if he would ever agree to pay them a cent. But Jack was no fool. He hired a property lawyer named Eleanor Briggs, an expert in rural land disputes. After a week of document digging, she delivered the truth. The gate was illegally installed. The road was not HOA property. The HOA had forged a legal easement claim to justify installing the gate. Jack's blood hardened. This wasn't arrogance anymore. It's fraud. Eleanor prepared a cease and desist letter supported by land records and county maps. It was a powerful legal strike, one that warned of a lawsuit, financial penalties, and criminal charges. Jack had it delivered straight to Richard Langford's office, but Richard didn't panic. In fact, he didn't even reply. The next morning, Jack found something new at the gate. Cement barricades had been placed behind it. The message was clear. They were not just blocking him, they were challenging him. The war had officially begun. For 3 weeks, Jack's life was held hostage. Hay deliveries couldn't get in. Livestock supply trucks had to turn back. The ranch hands had to cross fields with equipment on foot. Jack himself had to use an old mountain trail just to access part of his land. The HOA thought they were suffocating him into submission. They were wrong, because Jack Dawson wasn't the kind of man who backed down. He didn't scream, he didn't panic, he planned. He spent his days fixing fences, tending cattle, and studying satellite maps late into the night. He reviewed county laws, watched legal rulings, and prepared for something the HOA didn't expect: patience, justice, and revenge. He filed official notices. He documented everything. He built a mountain of legal ammunition and waited for the moment it would matter. Then something happened that broke the last thread of restraint holding him back. One morning he found tire tracks in fresh mud near his property line. At first he thought it was a passing hunter or lost tourist, but then he saw broken wood scattered near his eastern fence. A section of the fence had been intentionally cut down. A few yards beyond it, a stake had been hammered into the ground. It carried a marker flag with 3 letters written across it: HOA. They had stepped onto his land. That night Jack walked into his equipment barn and stared at the silent rows of machinery. Tractors, backhoes, plows, but his eyes settled on one machine, massive, rusted, and powerful: the Bulldozer. His father had used it long ago to clear the land that built the ranch. It hadn't been started in years, but it still ran strong. Jack stood in the darkness beside it and made a decision. There would be no more letters, no more negotiations. No more waiting for someone else to do what needed to be done. The Bulldozer would speak, and when it did, Pine Valley would never forget his name. The days that followed the fence incident carried an uneasy quiet, the kind that settles before a storm breaks open. Jack Dawson moved with methodical patience, but inside him burned a slow-building fury. He had given the law its chance. He had given the county time to intervene. He had presented documented proof of fraud and trespassing. But the system had failed him, and the HOA had grown bolder because of it. By now, the story had spread through Pine Valley. Locals whispered about the growing standoff between Jack and the HOA. Some called him stubborn, others called him a hero. But Richard Langford called him something else entirely: an example. And Richard had every intention of making that example a painful one. The gate remained locked. The barricades remained in place. The road was sealed. And now Richard had imposed a new threat: daily fines. Each morning a new envelope appeared zip-tied to the gate containing notice of penalty charges for unauthorized road access attempts. failure to comply with HOA membership policy, and security obstruction. The fines added up quickly: $500 a day, then $1,000, then $2,000. It was a number meant to intimidate, but Jack didn't react. He let them send their letters. He kept everyone documenting the growing list of violations for the judge who would one day see them. But while Richard believed he was tightening a financial noose, he didn't understand men like Jack. Jack was a rancher. Ranchers didn't fear paper threats. Ranchers feared drought, disease, storms, wolves. Men like Jack had already faced life's worst. Richard's game didn't scare him, not yet. Still, Jack knew the HOA was preparing another strike. Bullies like Richard never stopped at half measures. They always pushed until they broke something or someone. On a sharp, wind-bitten morning, Jack got his answer. He woke before dawn as always and saddled his horse to make a routine perimeter check. But as he rode along the north fence line, he saw something that froze him in place like winter stone. Survey stakes, dozens of them, freshly placed. Bright orange flags flickered against the dry grass. Every 50 feet along the ridge, another wooden stake drove straight into his land like a hostile invasion. Jack dismounted slowly and examined one of the flags. There, written in black ink, were 3 words that twisted his gut: HOA property expansion. The HOA had decided to take his land piece by piece. Jack followed the stakes deeper along the line until he reached a plastic folder zip-tied to a metal T-post. Inside was a printed notice, laminated to survive the elements. It claimed that Pine Valley had voted to expand its association borders to include unincorporated adjacent land necessary for neighborhood safety and improvement. They had voted to annex his ranch without his consent and without any legal right. This was war. He rode straight back to his ranch house and placed a call to Eleanor Briggs, his attorney. When she arrived later that afternoon, he led her to the fence line. She read the posting, her jaw tightened. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she pulled out her phone and began taking pictures. "There's no legal basis for this," she said finally. "None. This is flat-out land theft." She explained that what the HOA had done was a tactic: bully law. They used fake claims to scare property owners into paying them off. Most people didn't fight. Most people gave in to avoid court battles. But Jack didn't bend. Eleanor drafted another letter, a final legal warning. Demanded the immediate removal of the illegal gate, barricades, trespassing markers, and survey stakes. It warned that if the HOA refused, Jack would pursue full legal damages in court. The next morning, Jack drove the letter into town himself and handed it directly to Richard Langford at the Pine Valley HOA headquarters. Richard didn't read it. He didn't even unfold it. He simply nodded once, smiled a slow, cold smile, and dropped the letter straight into a shredder beside his desk. That was when Jack realized something important. Richard wasn't afraid of the law. Richard believed he was above it. Jack returned to the ranch with a hard new understanding. This fight would not be settled in a courtroom, not fast enough, not fairly enough, and not before the HOA tightened their grip even further. So Jack changed his approach. He stopped talking, he stopped warning, he began planning. He spent the next few days reinforcing boundaries along his land. Trail cameras were installed. Warning signs were placed. Evidence logs were updated daily. He documented everything with precision, not because he hoped to win peacefully, but because he intended to win completely. Then he turned his attention to the bulldozer. It sat in the equipment barn like a sleeping giant, coated in years of dust but built for power. Jack spent long nights tuning it. Fuel lines replaced, battery changed, hydraulic fluid topped, engine flushed, tires inspected. Each bolt tightened was a declaration. Each oil stain was a promise. By the time the sun rose on the 4th day, the bulldozer was alive again. Its engine roared across the ranch like rolling thunder. Cattle scattered, crows lifted from bare trees. Every neighbor within 5 miles heard it and knew something had changed. Jack didn't hide what he was preparing. He wanted the HOA to feel it coming before it arrived. But before he made his move, he would give Richard one last chance. He called for a meeting through his lawyer, insisting on a final attempt at resolution. Surprisingly, Richard agreed. They met on neutral ground inside the Pine Valley Community Hall. The meeting was formal, stiff, and pointless. Richard sat at the table, flanked by 2 HOA board members. Jack sat across from them with Eleanor at his side. Eleanor presented legal documentation proving the HOA had no ownership of the private road and no authority to annex Jack's land. She explained that their actions constituted fraud, harassment, and trespassing, each punishable by law. She stated clearly and firmly that if the HOA did not remove the gate and cease its activities, Jack would file suit. Richard listened without blinking. When Eleanor finished, he interlocked his fingers and leaned forward. He announced that the HOA board had taken a formal vote. They were doubling the daily fines. Jack would now owe over $60,000 in penalties. Failure to pay would result in a lien placed on his property. It was blackmail in plain form. Jack stood slowly. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. Eleanor gathered her papers. The meeting was over. The next phase had begun. That evening he drove home in silence. No music, no radio, just thought. He walked through his ranch, past the cattle, salt blocks, and windmill tower to the equipment barn. The air inside smelled like grease and gasoline. He stood beside the bulldozer, hand resting on the cold steel frame. He had given them every chance. He had played by the rules. He had waited for justice. But some people only understand force. Some people only learn when something immovable pushes back. He exhaled, the quiet resolve that lived in him for years finally surfaced. There was no hesitation now, no doubt, no fear. The line had been crossed. The next sunrise would not bring another warning. It would bring Bulldozer justice. The sun rose in a blaze of orange over Pine Valley, spreading early light across the dry earth and lonely ranch land. But this sunrise was different. This one felt heavier, carrying the weight of consequence. The long war of letters and threats had reached its final stage. The quiet before had ended. What followed now would shake the ground. Jack Dawson woke before dawn. He stood on the porch of his ranch house, coffee in hand, staring down the long road that led to the illegal HOA gate. The metal barricade waited like a silent insult. Behind it, Richard Langford and his board continued to believe they held power over him. They thought they could bury him in paperwork, intimidate him into submission, and seize his land inch by inch. But they misunderstood the man they were dealing with. Jack was not a desperate victim, he was a strategist. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment. He walked to the barn and uncovered the bulldozer. The steel giant loomed, restored and ready. Its massive blade gleamed like a war shield. He climbed into the seat, turned the key, and the engine ignited with a deep roaring growl. The sound ripped through the stillness of morning, a sound that carried a message across miles. Enough. The bulldozer rolled forward, crushing dry weeds beneath its treads. Jack drove slowly, not with reckless rage but with absolute control. He passed the horse corrals, the windmill water pump, the hay barn. Everything he had built, he had earned. No HOA, no corporate tyrant hiding behind neighborhood rules would ever take it from him. As he neared the main road, something caught his eye. A white SUV was parked off the path near the trees. Watching, waiting, he knew immediately who it belonged to: the HOA patrol. They had been monitoring him for days. He didn't even look in their direction. Let them watch. He guided the bulldozer toward the gate, but stopped short about 50 feet away. There was one last thing to do before he delivered his own brand of justice. He reached into the storage panel and pulled out a small black device, a body camera. He clipped it to his jacket, then raised a drone into the air. The drone ascended silently, locking onto a hover pattern high above. Every second from here on out would be recorded from 3 angles, unbreakable proof. He stepped down from the bulldozer and placed a single plastic bin in the middle of the road. Inside it were copies of legal documents, cease and desist letters, proof of land ownership, road records, trespass reports. On top sat a final written notice: final warning, you are illegally blocking private property access. Remove the gate immediately or it will be removed by force. Jack placed the bin where it could not be ignored. Then he returned to the bulldozer. But before he could move, more vehicles appeared: 3 sedans, a truck, then another SUV. The HOA board had arrived. Their cars lined up like a barricade of polished intimidation. Richard Langford stepped out of a silver Mercedes and began marching toward Jack, flanked by 2 board members and a hired security guard. His face was smug and expectant. He thought he had already won. They exchanged no words. Jack didn't need any. He climbed back into the bulldozer and throttled forward. Richard shouted something, waving his arms, but Jack didn't slow. The bulldozer rolled past Richard, past the security guard, straight toward the gate. Chains rattled, metal groaned. The HOA patrol scrambled back, shouting warnings, but nothing stopped him. The steel blade met the barricade and pushed. The entire gate twisted, groaned, and exploded off its hinges like a crumpled soda can. It scraped across the road, tearing deep scars in the asphalt before flipping over and crashing into the ditch. Jack drove forward again, shoving the concrete barriers aside. They slid like children's toys, helpless before raw power. The illegal blockade was gone, but Jack did not stop there. He pivoted the bulldozer and drove straight toward the metal sign declaring HOA access only. The blade rose slightly, then came down with crushing force. Metal split, wood snapped. The sign toppled and vanished beneath steel tracks. The message was clear: this road does not belong to you. HOA board stared in stunned silence. Richard shouted orders to the security guard, who hesitated, realizing the obvious: he had no authority here. Jack was on his land. He was operating within his rights. The HOA was powerless until the sheriff arrived. Blue lights approached in the distance, sirens silent, rolling fast. The sheriff's truck pulled up beside the wreckage of the gate. Sheriff Cole Parker stepped out, tall and worn from years of rough rural law work. He looked at the gate, then at Jack. Then at Richard. He sighed, the sigh of a man who understood exactly what was happening. The HOA swarmed toward him first, waving documents and shouting claims of destruction of property, trespassing, vandalism, reckless endangerment. But the sheriff held up one hand and said nothing until they fell quiet. Then he turned to Jack. Jack handed him a stack of legal documents. Sheriff Parker took his time reading each one. The drone continued to record. The HOA continued to wait. Finally, the sheriff spoke. He announced that Jack had every legal right to remove the obstruction. The barricade had been installed illegally. The HOA had ignored official warnings. This was self-defense of private property rights. No laws were broken. Richard's face turned red. He demanded that Jack be arrested. The sheriff didn't raise his voice. He simply said 5 cutting words: "This road isn't yours, Richard." The HOA president lost control. His final threat echoed out into the cold air. Jack would pay. He would be sued. He would lose everything. But no one moved to help Richard. Even his board members wavered, suddenly less convinced of their leader's invincibility. Sheriff Parker ordered Richard to remove the remaining debris by sundown or face county penalties. Then he left. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. As Jack guided the bulldozer back through his land, a change swept over him, not anger, not triumph, but something deeper. Resolve. The HOA had been embarrassed. Richard had been wounded. Men like him didn't retreat, they retaliated. This victory would cost Jack, he knew that, but he also knew something Richard didn't. He wasn't done fighting, he was just getting started. And Richard Langford had just learned the first rule of land war: never corner a man who knows how to build his own road. For a few days after the bulldozer incident, Pine Valley fell silent. The HOA's arrogance had been crushed as brutally as the gate itself, and the story spread across every corner of the county. Neighbors whispered about the rancher who stood up to the HOA. Photos of the mangled gate circulated online, turning Jack Dawson into something of a folk hero. But while some cheered, others plotted. Richard Langford was not a man who could accept humiliation. The image of that twisted metal lying defeated in the dirt replayed in his head every night like a nightmare. The HOA board was furious, demanding answers and trying to contain the scandal. Homeowners had begun questioning the fees they'd been paying for years, and a few even threatened to quit the association altogether. Richard knew if he didn't act fast, he would lose everything: the HOA, his reputation, and the illusion of control he'd built. So he turned to what he knew best: money and manipulation. Within a week, Jack's world began to change again. First, his mail stopped arriving. Then, a county inspector appeared on his property claiming there were concerns about his water well and waste disposal system. 2 days later, a zoning notice arrived at his door claiming his barn was non-compliant with county building codes. Jack knew exactly where this was coming from. Richard had connections. He had friends in the county planning office, in real estate, and law enforcement. The HOA president was using his influence to weaponize bureaucracy against Jack. Every form, every inspection, every fine, it was meant to drown him in red tape until he broke. But Jack didn't flinch. He gathered each letter, every citation, and handed them straight to his attorney, Eleanor Briggs. She worked tirelessly to counter every claim, proving most were fabricated or misfiled. Each time they knocked one accusation down, another would appear. It became a siege. Jack's days turned into a rhythm of defense, running the ranch by morning, answering legal nonsense by afternoon. But even as pressure mounted, he refused to be provoked into reckless action. His strength wasn't in emotion, it was in patience. Still, Richard wasn't finished. When paperwork failed, he escalated to harassment. Strange cars began parking near the ranch at night. Drone cameras hovered over Jack's fields. One morning, he found a trail camera strapped to a fence post near the property line pointed directly at his house. He took it down quietly. No police calls, no threats, just silence, because silence made men like Richard nervous. The HOA, however, began to crack from the inside. The board was splitting apart. 2 members resigned after learning about Richard's illegal gate installation. Residents started asking where their money had gone. A local reporter began sniffing around, calling it the Gate War of Pine Valley. Richard's empire was crumbling, but cornered men often bite hardest before they fall. Late one evening, as rain lashed across the plains, Jack heard the sound of an engine outside, a vehicle stopping near the gate road. He walked out with his flashlight. Through the sheets of rain, he spotted headlights flickering. A pickup truck. The driver didn't move. Jack approached slowly, rain hammering against his coat. The truck door opened. A man stepped out, his outline backlit by lightning. It was Richard. It was one of Richard's contractors, the same foreman who had installed the illegal gate weeks earlier. He didn't stay long, he didn't speak. He simply dropped a folder on the ground, turned, and drove away into the storm. Jack picked up the folder. Inside was a stack of documents, blueprints, invoices, contracts, all signed by Richard Langford. Every one of them detailed fraudulent charges billed to HOA homeowners, fake maintenance work, inflated road repairs, and fabricated community upgrades. It was everything Jack needed. The next morning, he handed the folder to Eleanor. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the evidence. This wasn't just a civil case anymore, it was criminal. Fraud, embezzlement, falsified records. If exposed, it could destroy Richard permanently. Eleanor warned Jack to be careful. Men like Richard didn't go down quietly. She advised turning the documents over to the county prosecutor. But Jack had a different idea. He wanted every homeowner in Pine Valley to see the truth for themselves. That week, anonymous envelopes began arriving in HOA mailboxes. Inside each one were copies of Richard's fraudulent invoices and a note that read, "This is where your money went." Within 48 hours, chaos erupted. Phones rang nonstop in the HOA office. Homeowners demanded answers. Board members resigned publicly. Richard's allies turned against him. And as the storm of outrage swelled, local media descended on Pine Valley. The story hit the county news under the headline, "HOA president accused of fraud and illegal property seizure." Richard's public image shattered overnight, but humiliation wasn't the same as justice, and Richard wasn't finished fighting. The following evening, as dusk fell over the ranch, Jack received a knock at his door. It was Sheriff Cole Parker again. His expression was grim. He handed Jack a folder, a lawsuit. Richard Langford had filed for damages, claiming Jack's destruction of HOA property cost over $250,000. The case was to go before the county court. Jack read the papers slowly, then looked past the sheriff out toward the horizon. The fields were quiet, but tension hung in the air like thunder waiting to break. He knew what this meant. Richard was gambling everything on one last move, trying to twist the law into his personal weapon again. But this time Jack had truth, evidence, and the community on his side. The rancher wasn't angry, he was focused, calm, calculating, because he knew how to fight this kind of war not with fists or fury but with exposure. He would not just defend himself. He would dismantle Richard's empire piece by piece. The bulldozer had cleared the road, now it was time to clear Richard out of power. As night deepened, Jack stood at the edge of his land, the distant lights of Pine Valley flickering below the hills. Lightning pulsed on the horizon like a warning shot from nature itself. The storm had started with metal and dirt, but now it was heading for the courtroom, where one man's arrogance would meet another man's unbreakable will. And by the time it was over, Pine Valley would never be the same again. End of Chapter 4. What began as a petty dispute over a blocked ranch driveway had now transformed into a war, one fueled not by anger alone but by survival. At first, Thomas Walker believed justice would prevail through the legal system. He believed proof, patience, and truth would be enough. But standing in the wreckage of what had once been his peaceful land, he now knew that power was never given, it was taken, claimed, and defended. The HOA had crossed a line so violently that there was no turning back. They didn't just harass him anymore. They didn't just fine him. They didn't just block his land. They had attacked his family. And they had done it like cowards, under darkness, behind lies, hiding behind a fabricated version of the law they twisted to suit their greed. That fire had burned more than one barn, it had burned away his last shred of restraint. Thomas had reached the point of no return. He woke before dawn the morning after the fire, standing alone on the edge of his property. The air was still thick with smoke. The blackened ribs of the barn stood charred and skeletal against the sunrise. Snow had begun to fall, light and silent, settling over the ruins like a funeral shroud. The insurance adjusters would take weeks. The county would bury their investigation. Sheriff Doyle, now exposed as a member of the HOA board, would make sure no evidence was found. That much Thomas already expected. But Daniela, the fire inspector, had delivered the one piece of hope he needed. Not everyone here is afraid of them, she had said. That stuck with him. He wasn't alone anymore. But this battle couldn't be fought with hope alone. He had to bring a war they couldn't hide, one too big for their lies to bury. One that would force the world to see what they really were. His strategy had changed. This was no longer about winning an argument, it was about exposing an enemy. Thomas started with evidence. Every interaction, every threat, every harassment, every violation of property rights, he documented all of it with brutal precision. Photos of the blockade, video of the HOA agents trespassing, screenshots of threats sent by HOA board members, bank trails, signatures, dates, logs. Then he built a mirror campaign, a digital one casting a spotlight on the HOA's corruption. But he didn't post anything yet because timing was everything. To trigger a collapse, he needed them to overreach again, one more public attack, something undeniable and irreversible. He would give them the bait. He called an emergency town meeting, not on HOA property, not under their rules. He hosted it on county road frontage, neutral ground. And he invited every rancher the HOA had ever bullied, not just in Timber Valley, but the neighboring districts too. Word traveled fast. Rural people looked out for their own. By afternoon, pickup trucks formed long rows of headlights in the snow. Thomas stood on the bed of his truck and spoke, not with fire but with calm, steady truth. He revealed forged documents the HOA had used to claim jurisdiction beyond their legal borders. He showed bank reports of emergency fees funneled directly into board members' accounts. He exposed Sheriff Doyle as a paid enforcer. Then he showed the photographs of his burned barn. You could feel the tension move through the crowd like a storm. People shifted from anger to resolve. They knew this wasn't just Thomas's fight anymore. This was about all of them. When the HOA arrived, including Kirkland Davis and his board of suits with clipboards, they tried to shut the meeting down. They waved cease and desist notices. They claimed trespassing. They demanded fines. They threatened mass arrest. This time nobody moved. Nobody backed down. The crowd stared at them in silence. Thomas said nothing. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He just looked at them, waiting for them to push too far, waiting for them to make the final mistake. Sheriff Doyle stepped forward, hand on his pistol. Perfect, Thomas thought, just a little further. But what happened next nobody saw coming, not even Thomas. A single voice stepped out of the crowd, a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, County Attorney Mitchell Graves, standing coatless in the snow, holding a sealed document. He announced in front of everyone that the HOA was under official investigation by the State Attorney General's office for fraud, extortion, threats, and racketeering. The crowd exploded. Kirkland Davis turned pale. Sheriff Doyle froze, and it was only then that Thomas noticed her standing behind Graves at the edge of the crowd. Daniela, she didn't smile, she didn't nod. She just watched it unfold with steady conviction, eyes locked with his. He had allies he never knew existed. The war wasn't over, it was about to get dangerous. That night, as Thomas returned to his ranch, a cold wind cut through the valley. Snow drifted across the dirt road. Something felt wrong before he even reached the gate. The chain on his front fence was cut. The gate was open. He reached for his rifle. Then he saw the message carved into the hood of his truck, deep, jagged letters cut by a knife. This is not over. Someone was here. They were watching. Their empire was collapsing, and now they were desperate. Thomas closed the gate behind him and locked it. He checked every structure on his land, every barn, every shed, every trailer, everything was intact until he reached the main house. A rock had been thrown through the front window. Inside, pinned to the wall with a hunting knife, was a single sheet of paper. It was a picture of his daughter, taken from a distance. At her school, they had made a move on his family again, not with fire this time, but with fear. Thomas stood in his darkened living room, fists clenched, eyes fixed on the threat. He had been patient, he had waited for the law, he had waited for justice. But now they had opened the last door they should have never touched, and on the edge of his land, sitting silent beneath a tarp, was the answer he had been holding back. The bulldozer, heavy steel, raw power, final justice. This wouldn't end in court, it would end in metal and earth, and by sunrise. The HOA would feel what real consequences look like. The night before the storm broke, the valley held its breath. Thomas Walker stood at the edge of his land with a final choice resting on his shoulders. Everything he had endured, months of extortion, property damage, threats, and now a direct attempt to terrorize his family, led to this singular moment. The legal battle had begun, true enough, but men like Kirkland Davis never surrendered to justice. They only understood force, and force was something Thomas had plenty of left. He stared at the tarp shape resting near the old equipment shed. Wind tugged at the canvas, snow dusted its edges. Beneath it waited a machine built not for threats, not for warnings, but for action. The sound of steel echoed in the frozen air as Thomas pulled the tarp away. The bulldozer roared to life, headlights cutting through the night. There would be no more letters, no more delays, no more negotiations. Tonight he would reclaim what was his. The HOA's illegal blockade still choked the only road leading to Thomas's ranch. Concrete barriers, metal gates, and stacks of heavy construction debris formed a wall just beyond his fence line, the same blockade that had started this entire war. They had no right to put it there, but they had. They had been warned by lawyers, land surveyors, and even state officials. They chose not to listen. That made what Thomas was about to do fully and unmistakably legal. Under property law, a man had every right to clear obstructions from his own land by any reasonable means necessary, especially when those obstructions restricted access to his home. And tonight those reasonable means came in the form of a diesel-burning 22-ton answer to harassment. The bulldozer moved forward, treads grinding over snow and hard earth. The steel blade lowered. Then Thomas pushed straight through the blockade. Concrete cracked, metal shrieked, chains snapped into the night. The first gate crumbled like scrap beneath the dozer's blade. He didn't stop to admire it. He kept pushing, clearing a path, removing every trace of the tyranny that had tried to suffocate him. But the blockade was only phase one. Thomas turned the bulldozer toward Windmere Hills, the headquarters of Kirkland Davis's corrupt HOA. Tonight the victims would not stay silent. Tonight the tyrants would be exposed not just in court, but in the very land they claimed to control. By the time Thomas reached the Windmere Hills sign, the tall, polished monument that marked the HOA's territory, he was no longer alone. Headlights appeared behind him. One truck, then 3, then 10, ranchers, farmers, loggers, horse trainers, men and women who had also been extorted and threatened by the HOA over the years. They didn't need to speak. They came to finish this. Thomas lowered the blade again and drove straight through the HOA sign. Stone exploded. Letters flew. The symbol of their authority shattered into the snow. The convoy moved forward. Their target was the lodge the HOA headquarters paid for with years of stolen fees used to fund a private clubhouse for board members, a fortress of wood and glass that towered arrogantly over the valley. When Thomas arrived at the lodge, he didn't slow down. He lined up the dozer. Steel growled forward, windows blew apart, walls buckled, beams snapped like bones. The building that once represented unchecked power crashed down in a thunderstorm of splintered timber, and Thomas never set foot off his land to do it. Because by the time the lodge fell, legal records now clearly showed the building sat 15 feet onto his privately surveyed property illegally. The HOA built their empire on land that didn't belong to them, and Thomas Walker brought it down. Kirkland Davis arrived too late to stop it. He came skidding into the wreckage in his SUV, suit wrinkled, face twisted with anger and fear. Rage poured out of him as he screamed for arrests, lawsuits, criminal charges. Sheriff Doyle moved to seize Thomas, but before he could speak, County Attorney Mitchell Graves arrived, emergency injunction in hand. Nothing Thomas had done was illegal, but the charges against the HOA were bank fraud, wire fraud, racketeering, extortion, arson, corruption of a public officer, witness intimidation, destruction of private property. Sheriff Doyle tried to flee, but state troopers surrounded him before he reached his cruiser. He was arrested on the spot, and Kirkland Davis, once a smug ruler of neighborhood tyranny, watched as his empire died in front of him. His board members were detained, his accounts were frozen, his lawyers refused to stand with him. The man who spent months bragging that nobody could touch him now trembled in snow and defeat. He had lost everything in one night. But Thomas wasn't done. With the troopers watching, he shut down the bulldozer and stepped down. Snow crunched under his boots. The crowd parted as he approached the wreckage. Slowly he reached into his coat, pulled out a single document and tossed it into the ruins of the lodge. It was an unpaid fine, one of the hundreds the HOA had sent him. A fine for noncompliance. That word no longer existed here. Windmere Hills had fallen. In the weeks that followed, rural communities across the state began sharing Thomas's story. News outlets interviewed victims. Lawyers came forward. Civil suits exploded. Politicians were pressured to reform HOA laws. State investigators uncovered a web of similar HOA schemes stretching farther than anyone imagined. Thomas rebuilt his barn, but he rebuilt something else too, his faith that strength wasn't about violence. Strength was about standing up when everyone told you to sit down. It was about protecting your land, your family, and your rights even when the world tried to bury you. And somewhere deep in the valley under quiet winter skies, the sound of a bulldozer engine slept, silent but ready, because men like Thomas Walker didn't start wars, they finished them. The end.